In September 1992, several hunters accidentally discovered an abandoned bus in the wilderness of Alaska, USA. Inside the bus, there lay the decomposed body of a man, curled up in the corner. In a camera found beside the deceased, the hunters discovered dozens of self-portraits frozen in the final moments of his life. Through the fragmented words recorded in his journal, they gradually pieced together the legendary life of this young man. It is said that countless people have seen reflections of themselves in his story. Some mourned deeply for him, calling it a tragedy of idealism, while others longed for his courage, seeing it as a bold act of breaking free from worldly chains. The soul forever frozen at the age of 24 was Chris McCandless. Chris was born into a wealthy family, yet his values were strikingly different. Despite his privileged background, he maintained a detached attitude toward material wealth. He often drove a worn second-hand car, yet with outstanding academic performance he earned a full scholarship and successfully graduated from Emory University. With his grades, the doors of Harvard Law School were wide open to him. However, this talented young man who could have easily stepped into the elite class made an unexpected choice. Chris donated the $24,000 he had saved during college to a hunger relief organization, cut up all documents that could prove his identity, and set out on a boundless journey. By returning to simplicity, he sought to forget the noise of the world, attempting to break free from worldly restraints and responsibilities. In June 1990, he headed west, racing toward the sacred land of his soul, Alaska. That night, he camped in the Arizona desert, unaware that it was the peak season for flash floods. At midnight, a sudden torrent rushed toward him without warning. Relying on sheer willpower and resourcefulness, Chris managed to survive the crisis, to completely sever ties with his past. He removed his car's license plate and burned the cash he carried, thus beginning his solitary life in the wild. He gave himself a new name, Alexander Supertramp. From that moment on, he truly began a life journey that belonged solely to him. Chris stayed in Jan's simple tent and traveled by hitchhiking. At every stop, he would spend long hours lingering with intention, absorbing everything around him. In the primeval forest, he paused his steps and quietly listened to the sounds of nature. In August 1990, Chris left Northern California and embarked on the Pacific Crest Trail. Almost at the same time, his parents realized they could no longer reach their son. Overwhelmed with worry, they drove to Atlanta in an attempt to find his whereabouts. However, upon arrival, they learned that Chris had already terminated his apartment lease 2 months earlier. Soon afterward, with the help of the police, Chris's abandoned car was discovered. There were no signs of struggle or violence inside the vehicle, which temporarily eased his parents' fears. But they soon realized that Chris did not seem to want to be found, and his disappearance might have been a deliberate choice. The reason Chris became who he was had countless threads tied to his original family. His mother had once intervened in his father's previous family, and he and his sister were in fact born during that earlier relationship. Within that seemingly wealthy and happy household, countless lies were hidden beneath the surface. In the childhood memories of Chris and his sister Corrine, there were frequent scenes of their father inflicting domestic violence upon their mother. That violence cast a shadow over their growing years, and he could never escape the label of being born out of wedlock. Yet he firmly believed that distant Alaska held the remedy for his wounded heart. After leaving the Pacific Crest, Chris encountered a pair of traveling nomads, Rainey and Jan. The couple warmly introduced him to a pure sanctuary called Slab City. Life there returned to simplicity and stood far away from worldly turmoil. If Chris was willing to go, Jan promised to give him a distinctive hat. But in the eyes of this wanderer, every encounter on the road was only a temporary connection. They spent a joyful day together. Yet at dawn the next morning, Chris quietly chose to leave. Because he knew the Alaskan wilderness was still waiting for him, Chris continued to savor the many flavors of solitude. And even a single apple he picked up became the most wonderful enjoyment of the moment.
I mean, you're really good. I mean, you're like 100,000 times better than like any apple I've ever had. I'm not Superman, I'm Supertramp. You're Super Apple.
He kept hitchhiking wherever fate led him, accompanied always by open fields and sunlight. Before long, September arrived, and Chris entered South Dakota, where endless wheat fields stretched to the horizon. To make a living, he had to bow slightly to reality and found farm work, operating a combine harvester to earn his keep. There, he met the farm owner Wayne. On that land, he experienced for the first time the joy of harvest. This man, rough in appearance yet delicate in heart, treated him like a brother. After learning that Chris longed for the Alaskan wilderness, Wayne helped him acquire a hunting rifle and even invited an experienced hunter to teach him how to hunt and preserve meat. Unfortunately, good times did not last long, and before the wheat harvest was completed, Wayne was taken away by authorities for operating satellite television services without authorization. Before leaving, he still reminded Chris to wait until spring arrived before heading north. But to Chris, without Wayne, the farm had already lost its vitality. Carrying the memories and earnings of that chapter, he set off on a new journey without hesitation. Chris entered the state of Colorado. That night, a kayak drifted into Chris's sight, instantly igniting the spark of adventure within him. He hid his belongings beneath a bridge and the next day went straight to the authorities to inquire about launching into the river. To his surprise, the staff told him that obtaining a launch permit would require a long wait of 12 years. But he would not wait 12 years, and without hesitation he used all his savings to buy the kayak. Plunging resolutely into the surging waters of the Colorado River, Chris happened to meet a wandering couple who admired this solitary young man and invited him ashore. The couple pointed out a new route for Chris. If he drifted along the river, he could reach the Gulf of California, a journey of more than 300 kilometers. Before they could speak much more, a patrol approached, and Chris had no choice but to leave. He drifted downstream, passing Horseshoe Bend and crossing through the Hoover Dam. In December 1990, he arrived at the Sea of Cortez. He kept company with whales and dolphins, and eventually entered Mexico through the spillway of the Morelos Dam. He dragged his raft across the desert and hitchhiked to the Gulf of California. In a cave, he lived for 36 days, until a violent storm blew his raft away. With no other choice, Chris had to replan his route and head north back toward the Mexican border. However, without any identification documents, he was helpless before the tightly guarded borderline. As dusk fell, he could only climb aboard a train bound for California. At dawn, before the train reached the station, Chris threw down his pack and quietly entered California along an abandoned drainage pipe. At a shelter in Los Angeles, he applied for a simple bed provided by Jan. After putting down his luggage, he could not wait to go out and explore, yet the sights on the street made him feel suffocated. Broken streets filled with wandering, disheartened souls. Through the glass window of a restaurant, he saw well-dressed men inside, and that was exactly the version of himself he had struggled to escape. Their rigid and hollow smiles stirred a surge of disgust and unease within Chris. He climbed onto another train, fleeing this cage of steel and concrete. This time he was unlucky, discovered by railway patrol officers and pulled off the train, where he was harshly reprimanded.
I never, ever, ever forget a face. If I see yours again, I won't arrest you, I'll kill you.
Chris returned once more to the bridge and dug out the belongings he had previously buried in the soil. For the dream of heading north to Alaska, he sometimes had to make temporary peace with steel and concrete. Yet deep inside, he remained that wanderer who refused to be restrained. During the year of Chris's disappearance, subtle changes took place in his parents' relationship. Whenever his mother saw a disheveled homeless man on the street, she would imagine it was the son she longed for. In December 1991, Chris finally arrived at the last free land of America, Slab City. By a twist of fate, he reunited there with Rainey and Jan, and at a gathering he met a beautiful young woman named Tracy. Tracy was proactive, gentle, and passionate, embodying everything young boys dream of in a first love. She took the initiative to greet Chris, and they walked together, listening to the legendary stories of an old man building Salvation Mountain. Tracy's eyes followed Chris at all times, filled with youthful shyness and sweetness. Together they pressed their handprints at the foot of Old Tree Mountain, and beneath the sunset they seemed perfectly matched. It was also the warmest period in Chris's life. That evening, Jan opened her heart to Chris and spoke of her long-buried past. When she had been the same age as Tracy, she had eagerly hoped to build a warm family of 3 with her husband. Yet fate played its part. and her former husband left her and their child when the child was still young. Jan had to shoulder the burden of raising her child alone. Later, Jan met her current husband Rainey and believed life had finally turned for the better. But during adolescence her son quietly left home and has never been heard from since. Whenever she looked at Chris, Jan could not help but think of her own child. From that moment on, Jan felt unworthy of being loved, often retreating into emptiness in an attempt to erase the limits of her past. As the days passed, the bond between Chris and Tracy grew closer. However, Chris focused on physical training and remained indifferent toward romance. Yet this only deepened Tracy's affection. Rainey subtly remarked to Chris that sometimes children can be too unkind to their parents. Those words stirred something deep within Chris, and he silently rose and left. When he arrived at Tracy's trailer, he found that she had been waiting eagerly, and she mentioned that her parents had gone into town. Yet none of this moved Chris, and instead he chose to accompany Tracy onto the stage, using self-expression to fill the emptiness inside him.
Make me an angel that flies from Montgomery, that I can hold on to believe in this living.
The familial warmth of Rainey and Jan and the tender affection of Tracy were not uncommon emotions in this desert. This desert had witnessed countless similar stories, people leaving noisy cities behind, carrying weary bodies and souls, searching for spiritual release. In this vast land, they finally set down their burdens and allowed their truest emotions and desires to flow freely. Yet at this moment, Chris cared only about conquering the Alaskan wilderness. He knew clearly that this was not the end of his soul's revolution. He was leaving again. Jan drove Chris to Salton City, yet she was unwilling to share a sentimental embrace at the moment of farewell. Feigning calmness, she let Chris leave with his luggage, only at the last moment tossing a package to him before turning away. Chris opened the package, and inside was the hat Jan had once promised to give him. Wearing the hat Jan had knitted by hand, Chris set off toward the Anza-Borrego Desert. In January 1992, at the Robbers' Roost campsite in the Anza-Borrego Desert, Chris met an elderly man named Ron. Ron wanted to see Chris's campsite in the desert. Seeing how young Chris was, Ron advised him to attend school or find work, so that his life might hold greater meaning. But Ron did not understand that Chris was already pursuing what he believed to be the most meaningful path. When speaking of his family, Chris simply said that he was alone in the world. Ron invited him to his home and shared the sorrow of losing his wife and child. After that dark chapter, he gathered himself together and opened a leather workshop. In this way, he had taken root there for decades, never once stepping beyond his comfort zone. During their time together, Chris not only learned the craft of leather carving, but often traveled around with Ron. Chris carved these memories one by one onto a leather belt. When Chris declared his intention to head to Alaska, Ron questioned what he was trying to escape.
You know, I could ask you the same question. You gotta get back out in the world. Really. Get back out on the road. I mean, the core of man's spirit comes from new experiences.
I'll show you, sitting on my butt.
And in the end, Ron was persuaded by Chris. Summoning courage, he finally took that step and climbed a mountain he had never ventured before. At that moment, a wave of sadness rose in Ron's heart, because he sensed that Chris was about to leave.
But you're wrong if you think that the joy of life comes principally from human relationships. God's placed it all around us. It's in everything, in anything we can experience. People just need to change the way they look at those things.
Yeah, I'm going to take stock of that. No, I am.
Deep down, Ron also understood that the root of Chris's wandering lay in that broken home he had left behind. Late at night on March 22nd, Ron was awakened by a sound outside his bedroom. He had long expected that Chris would choose to leave in this silent way. Ron quietly took out a pile of outdoor gear he had already prepared, gifts he had specially set aside for Chris. On the road to see Chris off for the last time, neither of them spoke. This bond, too deep to part with, would be buried in their hearts forever. Through Ron's tear-blurred vision, Chris's figure gradually faded into the distance. In April 1992, Chris arrived in Canada's Yukon by train. 2 days later, he reached Fairbanks. After 2 years, he had finally arrived in Alaska. After preparing some essential supplies and basic books introducing local plants and animals, Chris stepped alone into the sacred land of his heart, the Alaskan wilderness. He crossed snow-covered plains, waded through rivers, and entered Denali, the highest peak in North America. Chris left the hat Jan had given him hanging on a tree branch as a marker, then continued deeper into the wilderness. After surviving in the wild for several days, he discovered an abandoned bus 142. Chris named it the Magic Bus. Inside the bus, there were even a mattress, a stove, a lighter, and other daily necessities.
Is there anybody here? Guess not!
He cleaned the bus, dusted off the thick layer of dirt from the mattress, and from then on, the bus became his home. Chris raised his hunting rifle and aimed at a moose, but at the very moment he was about to pull the trigger, he suddenly realized that what he was aiming at was not only prey, but a mother. He gave up what could have been months of food. In this wilderness, Chris seemed to have found the purest way of living, free from worldly restraints and far from family turmoil. He fully embraced the days of living alongside nature, waking each morning feeling his truest self, breathing fresh air, and exploring this land filled with wonder. Chris chased herds of deer and ran freely across the wild. Tears filled his eyes, because he could feel that his soul, once stained by the mundane world, was slowly being cleansed. Yet he failed to notice that summer was arriving in the northern hemisphere and the snow and ice were beginning to melt. Weeks passed, and although his waistline had shrunk significantly, Chris's spirit grew stronger. The freshness of wilderness life never faded for him, but instead became even more intense. One day, he spotted a moose. Chris held his breath and slowly raised his rifle. And the moose fell. He hurried back to the bus and immediately opened the manual on preserving meat that he had prepared in advance. Time was critical, and he knew he had to process this precious harvest quickly, or in the warm climate the meat would soon spoil. Chris followed the method the hunter had taught him on the farm and tried to preserve the meat by smoking it, but he failed, and days later all the meat had spoiled and become infested with maggots. He could only helplessly return it to nature. He wrote in his journal, "I wish I had not shot that moose. This is one of the greatest tragedies of my life." After some time passed, Chris's supplies had nearly run out. He read a passage in a book.
"Then work which one hopes may be of some use. Then rest, nature, books, music, love for one's neighbor. Such is my idea of happiness. And then, on top of all that, you for a mate, and children perhaps. What more can the heart of a man desire?"
A passage from Leo Tolstoy's Family Happiness awakened Chris. He wrote in his journal, "When dawn gently touches the horizon, I need not step toward the unknown in secrecy, yet my heart remains bound to my homeland, as natural as breathing, as real as sorrow. When I leave, I will carry this understanding in my heart, my steps firmer than ever, holding a belief as eternal as the morning light, guiding me back. I was once covered in scars, yet every wound will eventually heal, becoming signposts pointing clearly toward the end." After conquering the Alaskan wilderness, Chris's spiritual revolution was complete, and it was time to return to reality. When he returned to the familiar small river, he was shocked to find that the once frozen surface had thawed. The river that had once been calm and gentle had now turned into a raging torrent. This river, suddenly transformed, mercilessly cut off the only path he could take home, and the hat he had hung on the branch was still there. He tried to judge the depth of the water, but the tree trunk suddenly snapped, and Chris fell unexpectedly into the rushing current. At that moment, the powerful force of the water nearly swept him away. Fortunately, he grabbed onto a branch just in time and struggled with all his strength back to the shore. In the pouring rain, Chris stumbled back to the magic bus. He knew he could not leave. Back inside the magic bus, Chris was surrounded by loneliness and fear. Worse still, the shortage of food made him increasingly restless.
Where the am I now? I'm hungry! I'm hungry! I'm hungry!
Prolonged hunger not only forced him to punch more holes into his belt, but also began to affect his mental state, and even reading could no longer soothe his anxiety. Chris began following the field guide, trying to find edible plants. Driven by hunger, he had no choice and ate the plant described in the book. The next morning, he woke to find that his body no longer obeyed him. He quickly opened the book again and examined it carefully, only to discover that the book also recorded a poisonous plant that closely resembled the one he had eaten. This plant could cause paralysis, and in severe cases it could trigger intense hunger and even death. A wave of despair surged through Chris. He carefully compared the plant's patterns with the illustrations in the book and finally confirmed that he had indeed made a fatal mistake. This plunged him into extreme suffering. Fortunately, Chris miraculously endured, but the extreme weakness had already robbed him of the ability to go out hunting. Even the grizzly bears showed no interest in this skeletal figure barely clinging to life. At this point, he was completely trapped by the wilderness, unable to find any way out. Chris's life force was fading bit by bit. He and the soul that had just been cleansed by the wilderness were once again trapped within it. With all his remaining strength, he wrote a line in his book: "Happiness is only real when shared." His eyes were filled with regret. As though countless unspoken sorrows remained, Chris struggled to wash himself. Then with the last of his strength crawled into his sleeping bag, lay on the mattress, and quietly awaited the end. His gaze drifted into the void, and in that moment he seemed to see himself traveling through time, embracing his parents tightly. Tears slid down from the corners of his eyes, and just like that, Chris completed the journey of his life. This is a true story. Chris was an idealist, a traveler in pursuit of beauty. Unwilling to be corroded by worldly civilization, he chose to withdraw from society, and in the end he faded into the wilderness. Some criticize him as selfish, believing he neglected his loved ones and disregarded the laws of nature. Yet others love him deeply and without reservation, because his spirit of breaking free and wandering freely inspired countless young people. And I, too, have unfolded maps in countless moments, wanting to leave everything behind and shoulder a backpack. Yet at every dawn I lock that thought away in a drawer and return to the rhythm of 9 to 5. Those impulsive plans to leave have ultimately become specimens pressed onto the final page of my heart. So what kind of life one prefers is not the most important thing. What truly matters is whether one has the ability to love it, whether one has tried with all one's strength to reach for it, whether one has the resolve to stand by it, whether one has the courage to choose and to let go, whether one has the right to decide.